Imagine an old photo album, its pages holding frozen moments from the middle of the 19th century. Before us unfold panoramas of the world's great capitals: St. Petersburg with its strict, majestic facades, Paris with its famous sprawling boulevards, Moscow and its monumental squares. The architecture is stunning in its perfection and scale, with wide avenues and paved streets ready to accommodate thousands of carriages and endless streams of pedestrians. Bridges, palaces, cathedrals, all of it testifies to a bustling life, the center of a civilization where the destinies of millions should have intersected. But something about these scenes feels deeply, inexplicably wrong. They are empty. Completely, unnaturally empty. There are no crowds in these pictures, no lively traffic, no random passers-by hurrying about their business. There isn't even the sound of children's laughter in the squares. The cities look as if their inhabitants suddenly vanished, leaving behind only impeccably built stone stage sets. An infrastructure designed for huge populations stands frozen in a deathly silence. Looking at these deserted landscapes, one single question inevitably arises, echoing in the mind. Where did all the people go? Of course, there are several standard answers to this puzzle, which are considered official and exhaustive. The first is that photographers of that era chose the earliest hours of the morning for their shoots, when the city streets were not yet filled with noise and bustle, and most residents were still in their homes. A simple and understandable version: the artist simply waited for the perfect light and a moment of solitude so that nothing would interfere with capturing the grandeur of the architecture. The second, equally popular explanation claims that the pictures were taken in the middle of a workday. In that era, we are told, all of society, from young to old, was engaged in labor. Adults were in factories, offices, and workshops. Children were in educational institutions. And so the streets were empty. No one loitered aimlessly. Leisurely strolls were not a part of daily life. Both of these assumptions sound quite logical, but they leave a feeling of something unsaid.
Could it be that not a single merchant opened his shop? Not a single cabman waited for a fare? Not a single child ran out into the street, even for a moment?
However, the main trump card of skeptics, the most compelling and, at first glance, scientific argument, has always been a technical feature of early photography. We're talking about long exposure times. The cameras of that time were imperfect and required the shutter to remain open for a significant period for an image to form on the photosensitive plate. This process could take 10 to 15 seconds. And according to some accounts, up to half an hour. With such technology, any moving object, a walking person, a moving carriage, even a tree branch swaying in the wind, simply wouldn't have time to be fixed in the picture. It would turn into a translucent ghost or leave no trace at all. Thus, only static objects remained in the photograph. Buildings, bridges, monuments, and perhaps those rare people who managed to stand perfectly still, as if rooted to the spot, for that entire length of time. This version seems coherent and consistent. It turns an unsettling mystery into a simple technical quirk, and allows us to close the old photo album with a sense of relief. It offers the comforting thought that people were on the streets. The imperfect technology just couldn't see them. But what if this convenient and logical theory shatters into pieces upon the first close inspection of the photographs themselves? What if, within these time-yellowed frames, there are hidden details that not only question, but completely refute the official doctrine of a 30-minute exposure? These details have always been in plain sight, but trusting the accepted explanations, we simply didn't notice them. The key to the mystery lies not in what is absent from the photographs, but in what is present. And this key can open the door to a completely different, far more shocking reality. Let's set aside the memorized answers and just take a closer look, because it may turn out that these pictures are not a technical artifact, but an impartial testimony of a world that has experienced something unimaginable. Let's return to these mesmerizing and unsettling images, but this time, let's arm ourselves not with trust in conventional theories, but with common sense and observation. Let's put aside the convenient explanation of long exposure and ask a simple question. What do our eyes actually see? If a photographer had truly kept his camera's shutter open for 30 or even 15 minutes, then even the slightest movement in the frame would have turned into a blurry, smeared smudge. The world doesn't stand still for half an hour. The wind rustles leaves, clouds drift across the sky, shadows slowly shift with the sun. A long exposure should have captured not a static moment, but the sum of all movements that occurred during that time. And the first thing that catches the eye and shatters the myth of long exposure is the trees. In many photographs adorning city parks, squares, and boulevards, they appear with astonishing clarity. You can make out not just the general crown, but individual branches, and sometimes even the outlines of leaves. Think about what would happen to a tree in half an hour. Even the lightest breeze, the most imperceptible gust of wind, would cause its branches and leaves to make thousands of tiny movements. As a result, the photographic plate would have captured not a tree, but a translucent, blurry cloud, a formless haze where the crown should be. But we see something else. We see sharp silhouettes, clear outlines, which indicate that the image fixation time was short enough to catch a moment of relative calm. Nature itself refutes the theory that has served as a veil for this mystery for so long. But the most convincing proof is hidden in those rare cases where traces of movement did make it into the frame. On some photographs, particularly the famous shot of a Parisian bridge over the Seine, you can discern faint, spectral figures. These are translucent silhouettes of people and longer, blurred outlines of horse-drawn carriages. Supporters of the official version might say, "You see, there were people, they just got blurred." But it is precisely these ghosts that become the key to the mystery and deliver the final verdict on the myth of long exposure. These traces are not proof of a crowd, but a kind of measuring tool left for us by a photographer from the past. They allow us to calculate the real exposure time with almost mathematical precision. The logic here is simple and irrefutable. We can use well-known standards as a baseline. The average speed of a person walking at a very brisk pace is about 2 meters per second. Now, if we measure the length of the phantom trail left by a pedestrian in the photograph, we see that it is between 4 and 6 meters. The simplest calculation, distance divided by speed, gives us the time. 4 meters covered at a speed of 2 meters per second takes exactly 2 seconds. 6 meters takes 3 seconds. The trails from carriages, as expected, are slightly longer, as their speed was greater. The result of this simple analysis is staggering. The exposure time was not 30 minutes, not even 1. It was within the range of 2 to 3 seconds. This changes the entire picture. It turns out that the photographic technology of the mid-19th century, contrary to popular belief, was already quite advanced and allowed for capturing reality almost instantaneously. A photograph taken in 1842, during the supposed period of the catastrophe, already possessed such technology. This means that if there had been crowds of people on the streets of Paris, Moscow, or St. Petersburg in the 1850s or 1860s, the camera would have captured them. We would see lively motion, perhaps with a slight blur on individual figures, but we would see life. Instead, we see emptiness. Now, this is not just a mystery, but an established fact. The technical limitations that served as a convenient shield have fallen. The cameras were ready to capture the world in all its fullness, but there was almost no one to capture. The realization of this fact gives rise to a new, much deeper and more disturbing question. If the technology could capture people, but there are almost none in the pictures, it can only mean one thing. The streets were truly empty in those years. But why? What event of unimaginable scale could have swept through these magnificent cities, devastated their metropolises, and erased millions of inhabitants from their streets, leaving behind only silent stones and a ringing void? The answer to this puzzle lies not in the archives of photographic history, but in the pages of our planet's geological and climatic record. We are no longer talking about the technical features of cameras. We are talking about the scars on the body of the Earth. Those frighteningly empty cityscapes are not an optical illusion, but an impartial witness's view of a world that was just beginning to recover from a global cataclysm. The event, which, based on a multitude of indirect clues, occurred in the middle of the 19th century, notionally around 1842, forever changed the face of civilization and wiped its former inhabitants from the face of the Earth. The photographs, dated to the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, did not capture daily life, but the process of the planet's slow resuscitation, the first steps of a new humanity on the ruins of an old world. This catastrophe was not a single, uniform event like a meteor impact or the Great Flood of ancient myths. It manifested differently in different regions, as if it possessed some sinister intelligence, choosing its method of impact based on geographic latitude. Across the vast territories of the Russian plain and parts of Europe, this phenomenon took the form of a so-called clay rain. It wasn't a violent mud flow that swept everything away, but something far stranger. Millions of tons of wet, clay-like mass descended from the sky. It covered fields, forests, and cities, with a dense, uniform layer that eventually dried into the very clay we find everywhere today. The most visible and irrefutable evidence of this event is our cities. Walk through the historic center of any old city and pay attention to buildings constructed before the mid-19th century. You will see that their first floors seem to be growing out of the ground. Windows that should have illuminated living quarters now face directly into the soil, and doors that once served as grand entrances have turned into low basement openings. Official science calls this the cultural layer, supposedly built up over centuries, an inch at a time. But this theory doesn't hold up. The layer of clay is uniform, it contains no traces of human activity, and its thickness of 2 to 3 meters could not have accumulated in just 100 or 200 years. It was a single, powerful deposit that buried the infrastructure of entire continents. A completely different picture emerges in the south. In the regions of North Africa, the Middle East, and the territory of modern-day Iran, the catastrophe manifested as a global fire or a massive thermal event. Old photographs of Constantinople, Cairo, and other southern metropolises from the second half of the 19th century show not just deserted streets, but cities buried under a thick layer of sand and a fine dust-like substance. This isn't the kind of sand carried by the desert wind. These are the traces of a colossal temperature shock that literally incinerated the topsoil, turning fertile lands into lifeless deserts. Where bustling life and modern buildings stand today, just a century and a half ago lay ruins, covered in the byproducts of this global fire. Thus, we see two sides of the same coin. In the north, the planet was covered in wet clay from the sky. In the south, it was scorched to the ground, turning soil into sand. It was a complex, planet-wide event. The cities weren't just abandoned. They had to be literally dug out and cleared. The small, new population that came to these areas couldn't handle millions of tons of clay. They did what was easiest. They leveled this new layer and began to build roads and a new life on top of it. That is why old cobblestones and foundations lie several meters below the modern ground level. But here, an even deeper mystery arises. One that brings us to the very core of this secret. The clay rain, for all its power, was not destructive in the usual sense. It didn't demolish buildings or break stone walls. It simply covered everything with a thick layer of mud. The ancient palaces and cathedrals we see in the photographs stand whole and unharmed. So why was it fatal for their inhabitants? Why were the cities, whose architecture withstood the elemental onslaught, deprived of their population? And who are those rare, lonely figures we do see in these pictures, 10, 20, 30 years after the catastrophe? Were they miraculously surviving members of the previous civilization, or were they entirely different people, pioneers who came to settle a deserted world? The catastrophe didn't just bury cities in clay. It conducted a monstrous kind of selection, destroying the former population while sparing someone else.
And to understand what happened, we need to delve into the mystery not only of this event, but of those who lived before it. So why was this event, which did not destroy stone walls, so fatal for millions of city dwellers? The answer lies not in the power of the elements that struck the earth, but in what changed in the atmosphere itself. The main reason for the mass disappearance of the former population was not the clay that buried the streets, nor the sand that covered the southern lands. It was in the air they breathed. The cataclysm brought not only physical precipitation, but also a radical, irreversible change in the natural conditions across the entire planet. It's likely there was a sharp drop in atmospheric pressure, a change in the composition of the air, or other parameters still unknown to us, which made the environment uninhabitable for those who lived before. And it is here that we come to the most incredible and shocking part of this hypothesis, which, however, can explain numerous historical and architectural inconsistencies. Let's think about the architecture of the Old World. The majestic palaces of St. Petersburg, the monumental buildings of Europe. They all impress not only with their beauty, but also with their gigantic dimensions. Enormous high doors, ceilings at an unreachable height, massive windows. Official history explains this as a pursuit of grandeur, an imperial style, an aesthetic choice. But what if this gigantism had a purely utilitarian, practical purpose? What if these buildings were constructed by people for whom such dimensions were the norm? A hypothesis is proposed that before the mid-19th century, the cities were inhabited by tall people, who could be called an aristocratic race of giants. Their height, judging by surviving artifacts and the dimensions of their buildings, was between 2 and 3 meters. They were the builders and masters of that magnificent civilization whose ruins we are exploring today. Their biology, their physiology, their entire organism was perfectly adapted to the old natural conditions, to that atmospheric pressure and composition. But when the catastrophe of 1842 occurred, these conditions changed dramatically. Their bodies, tuned to a completely different environment, could not withstand the shock. The new conditions proved fatal for them. A systemic failure occurred at the cellular level, and the vast majority of them could not survive this transition. Some may have tried to escape the cities for the countryside, but over the next 20 to 30 years, their existence still came to an end in a new, hostile world. But who, then, are those rare, solitary figures who appear in the photographs of the 1850s and 60s? Who are these people putting the deserted cities back in order? These were a different kind of people, people of our size. Their physiology, for some reason, proved to be more flexible and resilient to the changes that occurred. They endured the catastrophe much more easily. It is likely that the bulk of them lived in rural areas, and it was from there, years after the cataclysm, that they began to return to the abandoned cities. This process was not chaotic. By all appearances, it was carried out under someone's strict guidance. A small new population began the titanic work of clearing and developing the grand legacy left by the previous civilization. They did not build these cities, they settled them. They were the first settlers in a world that did not belong to them.
The most convincing evidence of this resettlement process is a comparison of photographs from different decades. Pictures of St. Petersburg from the 1850s and 60s show an almost complete lack of life. In a famous photograph of Palace Square from the 1860s, the shadow from the Alexander Column indicates the time is around 4 or 5 in the afternoon, the height of the day, a time of maximum activity. But the square is absolutely empty. However, if we look at photographs of the same places taken just 20 years later, in the 1880s and 90s, the picture changes dramatically. There are significantly more people on the streets, traffic begins to move, and the city gradually comes back to life. We are not just looking at old pictures, we are watching, in real time, the process of the slow colonization of dead cities. Life is returning to St. Petersburg, as it is to other metropolises. This is no longer indirect, but direct evidence that the desolation that began in the 1840s was real, and only towards the end of the century did the cities begin to fill with new inhabitants. And now we stand on the threshold of the final, most important mystery. If an event of such unimaginable scale occurred, cities buried under a multi-meter layer of clay, entire regions turned into deserts, and the planet's former population almost completely replaced by another type of human, then why is there not a single line about it in official history textbooks? Why are we forced to piece together the truth from the analysis of old photographs, geological anomalies, and architectural inconsistencies? Where are the written records, the chronicles, the documents describing this greatest upheaval in human history? Why does our history seem to start from a blank slate precisely in the middle of the 19th century? This deafening silence in the historical archives is the most disturbing and most eloquent proof of all. It suggests that the catastrophe did not just happen. Its aftermath was deliberately erased from human memory. And so we come to the final and most important question, which hangs in the air like a storm cloud. If everything happened this way, if the world experienced a catastrophe that changed its physical and demographic landscape, then why is history silent about it? Why is there not a single document, not a single chronicle, not a single official report about this event in our libraries and archives? The answer to this question is simple in its formulation and terrifying in its implications. A total, comprehensive falsification. The deafening silence of history is not an accident or the result of ancestral negligence. It is the result of a deliberate and meticulously planned operation to erase humanity's memory. Immediately after the consequences of the cataclysm were generally dealt with and a new order began to be established, a campaign of unprecedented scale was launched to cleanse the information field. This process continued for decades, right up to the beginning of the 20th century. It proceeded along two main lines: destruction and substitution. All documents that could shed light on the true events of the mid-19th century were methodically confiscated and destroyed. Chronicles, official reports, eyewitness diaries, church records, maps showing the world before the catastrophe, all of it was declared non-existent or irretrievably lost in the fires, floods, and wars that so conveniently occurred during this period. An artificial information vacuum was created, a black hole in our timeline that needed to be filled with something. And it was filled. In parallel with the destruction of old evidence, work was underway to create a new alternative history. New textbooks were written. New chronological tables were compiled. Necessary documents were forged or found, and the surviving old ones were edited beyond recognition. Those who were behind this global reset, let's call them the architects of the New World, wrote a new, convenient, and, most importantly, controllable biography for the new humanity. In this new version of history, there was no place for a clay flood, a global fire, or, especially, a civilization of giants. Every inconvenient fact,
Every piece of material evidence that could not be hidden was given a simple, logical, and completely harmless explanation. The first floors of old buildings buried several meters deep? That's just a cultural layer, naturally accumulated over the centuries.
The giant doors and impossibly high ceilings in palaces? That's merely a feature of the imperial architectural style, designed to emphasize the monarch's greatness and inspire awe in the common people. And the empty cities in the photographs? Just a technical quirk, a consequence of the long exposure of imperfect cameras. Thus, step by step, a shocking reality was replaced by a comforting fiction. The greatest catastrophe in the planet's history was reduced to a set of scattered, unrelated trivialities. Therefore, the empty photographs of the 19th century are not a technical glitch. They are direct and irrefutable proof of the greatest mystery in human history. They are a window into another world that existed before us. And now that you know this, you will never be able to look at old cities and old photographs with the same eyes again. The evidence is everywhere. You just have to learn to see it. It's in every basement floor that goes deep underground, in every disproportionately tall palace door, in every empty square in a time-yellowed picture. The history that was hidden from us continues to look at us through the veil of time, waiting for when we will finally be ready to see the truth.